Hello and welcome to Culture, the world's first esoteric festival. This is our channel. Great to see you here, and it's recorded in the Marrakesh studio. So we say in Moroccan, Jujuka, something good come to you. Well, this show was recorded some time ago in 2020, but we brought it back. It was a telephone interview, not recorded within the Marrakesh studio actually, but it's still very poignant, I feel. From truthagenda.org, and what a wonderful speaker he is, and he's agreed to come on the show, and I'm very happy to see him. So here is Andy Thomas. Hi Andy, and welcome to the show.
Hello, lovely to be here.
The world is changing at the moment, and it's in the grip of a social revolution, a pandemic, a painful rebirth perhaps. Values and established norms are being brought into sharp focus. Do you think this current movement of 2020 is a long-expected step change for humanity?
I think there's always change going on somewhere, and pick any age, any era, and you're going to find people who feel that something big's in the offing. But what I do think we have at the moment is perhaps a confluence of events. I was somebody that was very interested in the prophecies for the year 2012, that would be at least the beginning of a long period of change. And, if we look back over the last few years, we can certainly see there has been a feeling of acceleration. People are not as they were. The political situation around the world, it all seems to have sort of bubbled up into something that is a bit more than what we've been dealing with in recent times. And, I think for those people that are always hoping for a raising of consciousness, that phrase that we often use, I think what they're seeing at the moment is that is happening, but it's not happening through a blissful ascension. It's happening through hard lessons. And the movements that we're seeing in the world now, many of them are quite reactionary, but that in itself is often how change begins. It might not be the perfect method of doing it, but then you have to try to sort of put all that passion that's currently bubbling up in different directions. You have to put that to some kind of use. And I think that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing a lot of reactionism. We're seeing people with a lot of deep cares, but perhaps not yet a clear way forward. But I do think that will come. And I do think that we do live in times where it's perhaps time to put this all together, stop just seeing it as all sort of separate things, and realise this is a road towards some kind of new consciousness. But it won't necessarily be easy. Maybe that was always the mistake some people made, the view that we'd all wake up one day and we would all be enlightened. Yeah. Well, we may all be enlightened, but it comes with work. You don't often get the free lunch. You have to do the work as well. And I think what we're seeing in the world today, we're being faced with doing that work. We've got to look at it. We've got to come up with the solutions rather than them all being given to us on a plate. So it's a daunting time, but it is also an exciting time. And I think if we grasp the nettle, we could come out of this with something very powerful and very useful. But if we sort of stumble around and we keep reacting and not forging a clear way forward, I think that's going to make the process much harder.
I think you're right. I went and heard you speak about a year ago. It was a wonderful talk in the Sussex countryside, and you mentioned about the English Civil War, and there were several pathways for people to go down. You had the Levellers and other organisations putting forward new ways of living other than under the feudal system. As it turned out, we ended up with a stronger parliament and Oliver Cromwell, and we went down that road. Is there something like that going on at the moment? Are we looking for grasping at new ideas and pulling them in?
Many parallels with the English Civil War, and that began, I would say, here with the Brexit debate, because what Brexit did, whichever side of the divide you stand on, it did polarise people, but at the same time it did force them to think about what it means to be British, or maybe English if you really want to boil it down. And I think that's been an important thing to do. we saw that same polarisation in the English Civil Wars. Suddenly people had to decide, did you support the King, Charles I, who until that point had been seen as God's voice on earth, or did you support Parliament, who on one level seemed to be going against that, and yet others thought, well, maybe now God speaks through Parliament. That continual question we ask ourselves, which is, what is divining the universe for us if we take the word God out of it? It was the same question back then. And I think many people felt the same with Brexit. It's like, well, if we make a wrong move here, we could be trapped in something that won't serve anybody. And of course, not everybody agreed with each other, hence the endless sort of tumult in Parliament that we saw. But out of this time is coming, new movements. People are saying, as they did in the English Civil Wars, look, everything, is being levelled here. All the things we took for granted, they're crumbling away. So maybe this then is the opportunity to try to create something new. And back then we had religious movements like, we had the evangelical movements, the Quakers. We had groups like the Diggers that read the Bible and thought, God gave the world to us, so let's go and dig it up wherever we want. It seems bizarre, but these were really important things for people. And now we're in a sort of a new phase where we've got the Black Lives Matter movement, which has suddenly bubbled up. We've got freedom movements bubbling up against the pandemic restrictions. It's as if suddenly people are again being faced with, do we just go with something that we don't feel comfortable with and forever stay on a kind of a downward spiral, or do we stand up, stick our heads above the parapet and take a chance? And although those times are never comfortable, and the English Civil Wars were deeply terrible times, we're nowhere near on that level now, so let's be clear about that. But nonetheless, the parallels are that, it feels troubling at the moment. It feels like nothing is stable, but sometimes those are the moments where the new movements will come up, and they will take years to find their final sort of apogee. And yet, you have to start somewhere. And I do see that happening now. So yes, in the same way that the English Civil Wars turned out to be the beginning of a new Britain. And I think that will be the same here. And hopefully a fairer place, hopefully a place where everybody will be heard. And there will be some kind of new value come in that will not just be money and power based. We can only hope.
Well, I can see that, and I totally relate to that. There are several noticeable value disconnects between establishment aspirations and the state actions against people. Prime example is the violent removal of peaceful demonstrators outside the White House to make way for a president to preach Christianity with the Bible. Do you think that it's time for a discussion on a return to ethical power exchange between beings?
Well, I think the problem is, we have these systems in place to elect our leaders, and we've long known that they're not very good. They're the ones that we've wound up with, and some are better than others. I mean, I'm very proud of British democracy, but at the same time, that doesn't mean it doesn't have its faults. In America, they have their own problems, and many people feel very strongly about Donald Trump, of course, either for or against, but those that feel that he is an aberration and that he should be removed, I think we'll need to look at the systems over there that allow people like that to get to the top, rather than perhaps directing all the ire at Trump himself. It's a much more complex situation than I think people give credit for. And the only way you will get better leaders there or anywhere else is to look at the fundamental systems that allow them to rise to the top. And sadly, it is usually people with a lot of money and a lot of power that are able to muscle their way up. And it's not always the case. Some people, some MPs here, have started from very humble roots, but it does tend to seem that the old sort of power structures, the secret societies, the old boy networks, they're always there in the background, and until we break that, we will not get something new. So we need to, yes, absolutely have more credible governance. We certainly do need some perhaps more well-rounded characters, let's say that, but we're only going to get them if we clear the way for them, if we build roads towards that. It's not going to happen overnight. And ultimately, true reform, going right down to the deep grassroots, is the only way this is going to happen. All the time we're hoping for big change based on exactly the same systems that have got us here in the first place. They're doomed to failure. But these changes, they're like turning around an oil tanker. It will not happen quickly, but you have to take the steps to begin that turn. And that's where we are now. But I'd like to hear more talk about the reform of the systems, not just arguing about the people we do like and don't like, because ultimately they are only there because we all collectively have allowed them to be there.
Sure. I mean, there are searching questions globally because we've been talking about democracy. We've talked about USA and UK. Possibly you could put the EU into that. The rise of China, and perhaps Russia too, poses very searching questions. State control, a surveilled society, a police state, a gagged press, and so on. Is the dominance of the democratic USA a leverage against any of this?
Well, of course, many would look at some of the events going on recently in the USA and wonder how democratic they actually are, but you could probably level that at any democracy. I think the US is in a troubled time in its history, and again, I think it's being faced to really look at what it is, and it's not yet coming up with the answers, but it might do. And I think that the problem perhaps we've had in the last few years is that under Trump's, premiership, he's stepped back from world politics, and therefore the countries that are very forward in that, like China and Russia, but China especially, they have taken advantage of that. China has been investing in places like Africa. It's been, putting in infrastructure for countries whereby there are just indelible links now between all of these places. And China, therefore, will take more power. No, you can't knock them for doing that. That's not necessarily a wrong thing, but whereas America used to be out in the world doing that, it's doing that less so now. It's turned more insular. And the problem with that is when you get more insular, you wind up in a situation where you allow others from the outside to gain more power. I think Russia is, always going to be a big player in all of this, but I don't think that it currently poses the threat to America that China does. Because China, I think, has so much financial clout, more so than Russia. Russia has enormous political influence in some parts of the world, yes. But I think how we deal with China is going to very much determine the future. And we see their authoritarianism very much growing, and in certain other countries. And we see democracy really on the back foot at the moment. So I think democracy has to look at what it really stands for now, and it needs to look at, is this the right way to do democracy? We, over here, we're used to it. We do not want authoritarianism. But if we're living in a world where it's the authoritarian nations that are gaining ground, we have to really ask why. And we don't want to become the same, but we have to find a way to balance that and use, our strengths to their fullest. And I think we've taken the eye off the ball and allowed other things to come in, and that's a real shame. And just one thing I would add, the West has, of course, helped China to get some of the very technology that it's now using for surveillance and for that authoritarianism. We have helped them. Companies like Google have given them that technology, helped them develop it. And, of course, the only worrying thing there is, well, at what point, then, do we think that that technology isn't going to be used here in the West against us? And we already see, a huge rise in surveillance and censorship. So, we need to be very careful we don't become the very things that at the moment we claim we stand against. But ultimately, polarization won't be the way forward. We don't want a war with anybody. But we do need to identify where the divisions lie and how we best deal with them. And we deal with them, I would imagine, ultimately by being the best that we can be. But we need to engage. And just pretending there aren't issues in the world will not be a solution.
In a way, the pandemic has brought countries together. because they faced a common enemy, this germ that's around the globe. And I think if there are some questions about the survival of humanity from global warming and other issues, the rising oceans and so on and so forth, there will have to be, at some level, cooperation between China, America, EU, whoever, Africa. That these people will have to, won't they, Andy? I mean, it can't go on like it is.
I mean, obviously there are still debates about quite what the level of climate change is and what's causing it, though we're not allowed to talk about them anymore. But clearly something is in the offing. There's something shifting. It's not the same as it was. We should note here that China is actually at the forefront of certain technologies which may yet help with the environment. Now, at the same time, they're still using a lot of coal power stations and, they've got their own issues to deal with. But it may well be that in trying to deal with them, that they actually find a seam of new technology that might, if not be the whole road out of this, it might point the way. I mean, ultimately, we all need to take responsibility for our environment. There's no other way to look at it. And whether you believe in global warming or don't believe in it, we can see the destruction going on around us of habitat, of places that should not be destroyed. And yet still, because money and power is pushing the agenda, it doesn't seem to stop. And I think that's the sad thing. I would say collectively, most people don't want a world that we destroy. Most people would look at it and say, we need to, be very reasonable here and preserve it. And yet we're trapped again in a system that's old, that is based on money and power. And that doesn't mean the money and power people want to destroy the world, but that's the system they're stuck in. And so we go on forever and ever. We still believe that economic growth is the only way forward, so we keep building houses, we keep covering up fields, we keep destroying habitat. The Amazon rainforest gets cut down, you've got to feed people. The people there have no money, so they're just doing what they have to do to survive, and you still wind up with the same problem, which is a lot of destruction. So we have to somehow go right back to the base of all this and deal with, how can we create a whole new system? And I keep talking about systems in this conversation, but I think that's the crucial thing. And I think, again, we're still not looking at the fundamentals of why these things come about. I do not believe personally that the New World Order, or whoever they are, wish to destroy the world, although some might argue otherwise, but I think that they are trapped themselves in these paths that ultimately do that. And something has to shift, and we need to learn that power maybe can reside in looking after the world, not just dominating it. And that very hard sort of Newtonian way of looking at dominating nature, I think, is one of the problems. We need to go back to understanding that we are part of it, and we need to be in true harmony with it. And that's a whole philosophy, that's a whole psychology that's going to need dealing with, not just sort of tinkering about at the surface and arguing about carbon targets. There's a far more fundamental argument that needs to be looked at, and I think until the day we do that, we're still going to be on a very dangerous trajectory.
It's interesting because Macron fired off a salvo against Brazil for destroying the Amazon, and they entered into a public row about this, and I think Macron described it as the world's lung. You're destroying the world's lungs, so we need the Brazilian end of it to stop destroying the Amazon. However, I was going to ask you about information. Information technology is accelerating, and AI is hurtling towards humanity. It's coming to us at a great pace. Where do you see us in about 10 years from now, 2030?
I think that one of the underexplored aspects of where we're going at the moment, it does involve automation and artificial intelligence. And, I mean, there are discussions, of course, but I do not think people are truly understanding the level of how that will change our lives. Now, we're only really at the beginning of it, but when you start to find a world where, let's call them robots, to use the very basic term, when they can actually do as good a job as we can in many areas, you have got a fundamental shift, because that means we are going to suddenly be on the sidelines. And, when the majority of useful things can be done by machines, when do we suddenly realize that we have become redundant? What then is our part in the world? Many people are absolutely focused on work. The whole meaning of their life is what they achieve, how they work. Not everybody is set up for a life of leisure. So what will drive people in the future when we reach that point? And what will happen to the economy? That, of course, is a huge one. At the end of the day, companies will use the technology that will get the work done most swiftly and most economically. And sadly, although we'd like to dream that people will always have a place in this, the economics are likely to drive it at the moment. And then you're left with larger and larger amounts of the population that have no income. So then you have to create some kind of, collective income society, which then risks becoming communism. And then again, we go back to the old problems of that. And then artificial intelligence itself, when it reaches a point where actually it's making better decisions than we are, when does humanity step aside and say, okay, well, that's clearly the way forward, we'll leave them to it. But then again, where are we left? So, these are big sci-fi questions that many people have pondered for many, many years. But we are now, I think, coming to a time when we're going to be faced with them in a very real way. And I personally would like to see a lot more discussion, a lot more preparation for this world, because we're running blind into it. And then when we get into the issues of transhumanism, where, machinery and biology blend, which we've already begun, the day we first put a fake heart in, transplants, where does that end? At what point do we become the Cybermen and we lose our souls?
Yeah.
These things are very important questions, and I don't think just running blind into the future thinking, well, it'll all be all right, is necessarily the sensible approach. So, yeah, I would like to see much more consideration of these areas.
I heard a podcast about a year ago with Elon Musk, and he was talking about the transhuman, and he more or less said, to paraphrase, if you're going for a job somewhere and the person next to you's got these implants and if they can speak 14 languages and the professor of maths, and that's necessary for this job, by default you've got to join in the party. You've got to have a similar skill set in order to go for that interview and get the job. And so by default it's already going to happen. You could always see that there's no way out of this, is almost suggested.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think that's when you then start to get dominant stratas of society, and whether it's because they are mechanically enhanced or genetically enhanced, that's a whole other thing that's coming around the corner.
Yeah.
But you're right, you then get tiers of society where one will inevitably look down on the other, and those that do not have those, well, inverted commas, advantages, will suddenly find that they are left on the side. And yeah, this is a big problem, but it is something that we will have to face. And wouldn't it be lovely if we actually entered into this situation with true consciousness of what we're doing, instead of just stumbling into it, which we often seem to do, but, we can see what's coming. And it would be very good to try to divert some of the major issues that could come with this. But at the moment, we're still stumbling, and it would be nice to see more focus on the likelihood of what is going to happen.
Well, some of the topics that we've chosen to discuss today are quite weighty, and a lot of this hinges on choices, as we've said. The choice to be more conscious and express our innate nature. Is the answer for humanity more simple? Is there a simpler life for us out here?
I think that, as we've touched on here, I think we need to get back to a few core issues about what it is to be human. One of the problems that we have is that I think we have not respected nature. We have not respected our relationship to it. And so for some, I think that's why the world has fallen into a state of destruction, because many people see themselves as separate from it and don't understand our innate connection with it. And so that begins to atrophy. I think embracing the importance of the natural world and realizing we are part of that, we are not apart from it, which I think is something we've fallen into, I think that will bring us back to a greater connection with, everything, really. So I think understanding our place in the cycle of things would be very good, and realizing we cannot just dominate it because it's there to be dominated. That's not how it works. So that would be good. But I think the other thing is we need to understand that we have a spiritual nature. Now, that doesn't mean you have to be religious, but again, we've got into this very reductive world that seems to treat us purely as mechanisms. And it seems to me, at least, that we are much more than that. And I suspect consciousness research will eventually show that we are more than just flesh and blood and mechanical objects walking around that happen to have biological components. I think looking at that may take us somewhere, and I'd like to hope there will be a re-embracing of the notion of spirit. It'll be a new notion, it won't be the old notion, but it will ultimately connect with it. So I think that would be very useful for humanity. And ultimately, the old cliche, love, peace and understanding, a bit of that wouldn't go amiss. And I think just to focus on that and stop trying to get one over on the other, but try to realise we're all in this together, cut the polarisation and work together. That might get us somewhere, because at the moment, we're so often forced into reactionism and polarisation, and that, of course, is classic divide and rule, and it doesn't get us anywhere. So we need to go the other way and just be really aware of when we are being forced into polarisation.
But there are philosophers and sages who suggest that humanity does receive help from a higher angelic energy or frequency, if you want. Can this explanation of a possible step change help us in our current situation? Is it like a snakeskin being shed?
I'm totally, open to the notion that there are other stratas of consciousness beyond the ones that we see. And what context you put that into, whether you see it as religious or the ascended masters, or you see it in a very abstract way. I do think there are levels of existence that we don't touch when we merely reduce everything down to physicality. So yes, I think that in some way reconnecting with that, again, could offer a way forward here. I think that we need to be careful, though, that we don't sort of go into sort of spiritual dogma. Movements that wait for rescue by, whatever ascended masters or whoever they may be. That's lovely. But it worries me a little bit that it can abdicate responsibility. And as I said earlier in this conversation, we're at a time, I think, where we now need to be proactive. We need to take responsibility and realise that real change, comes by doing it. It's sitting back and waiting for it, I suspect, isn't going to do it. So it's fine. Let's try to be aware of other realms that may exist. Let's try to touch them where we can and, embody that, embrace that. But as long as it doesn't fall into that category where we're all waiting for something external to us to come and put everything right, I don't think it works like that, and I think it's time to realise that, and I think we will get far more done by, realising it's time to create the world that we want, not sit back and allow other forces, whether they exist or not, to create it for us. But I certainly believe that there is more to the world than just what we see immediately in front of us, and I would like to hope there could be a new open-mindedness, because we have got into a very closed-minded world of scientism all too often. Science is wonderful, but when it becomes scientism, that then closes avenues. It refuses to look at things that might actually be there, because at the moment it doesn't fit their narrow band that they have declared as reality, and so they ignore potentially important things which may lie outside of that. So I hope that we'll re-embrace that, and I do hope that scientism, maybe through quantum research, whatever it may be, will lead them back to realising that actually we do all affect each other. We are all interconnected. We are entangled. That word, we are entangled. It's becoming ever clearer that we are. And therefore we may be entangled not just with ourselves, but potentially other realms as well. And that may open up a whole new future.
That's really interesting. And I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to actually ask you, if I made you chairman of the United Nations, where would you take things globally?
Haha. Well, I mean, the first thing I would do would be to try to encourage an environment, and again, I am repeating myself, of not getting into polarization. At the moment, everybody's divided, whether it's Democrat or Republican, Leave or Remain, white or black. It's all about polarization. This has always been used to control us, and many people feel that's being manipulated heavily at the moment. The only way forward that I see it is to learn some nuance. And, if I was up there, I would be encouraging people to take a nuanced look at the world. Stop reacting. Everybody is continually encouraged to react to something with passion or whatever it may be. But the trouble with that is we often then don't think something through. We don't feel our way into it. And I think that that's a serious issue that we really need to consider. How do we look at both sides of an argument and realise that perhaps the truth will lie somewhere in the middle? Because in my experience, that's mainly where you get to the truth. Saying it's all over there or saying it's all over here, it never works. But people fall so easily into it. So nuance, a little bit of just stepping back from immediately sounding off about something that has upset you in that day or in that moment, and just thinking, but could there be another side to this? That's something that I would try to encourage. And maybe one day we'll get there. Although somehow I'm not sure I ever will wind up leading the United Nations, but let's hope somebody out there does, that has a new vision that isn't just about division, it's about realising there is something we could all have in common.
It's interesting because Nicholas Roerich, the painter, Russian painter, who was a theosophist, he had an enormous influence in the United Nations at one stage. And I think there's still a Lucis Foundation out there. I don't know if you've come across that.
I'm aware of it. I don't know very much about it. I think there are movements around the world. There are people who can see what's going on. They know that something needs to shift and to change. But, when you look back through history, that's when you realise movements like that, they take a long time. Very seldom does anybody get all the changes they want, even in a single lifetime. But then you look back, and perhaps after a couple of centuries, you can see that things that were begun long ago, gradually they did achieve their aims. And it just didn't look like it at the time, but they set balls rolling, and you find that it became something. So that's the thing. We always want instant results now. We live in a world where if you don't get an instant result, you give up. I think that that's something else that we need to look at again. We need to realise there are longer games here that we need to play and sow seeds. And you may not see those seeds grow and flower, but you might just see it germinate and hope that others will come along and keep that germination going in the future.
It's a very difficult time because we are accelerating. Information, as we've mentioned already, is accelerating, and life is accelerating. I was going to say, I've listened to your informative talks, and I've followed your work, Andy, over the years. What would your advice be to young minds wanting to open up to these massive changes which are appearing right now on our planet?
I think it's really the same advice that we were talking about a moment ago. I think especially when you're young, and I was exactly the same, it's very easy to react to things. We've got all this amazing young passion and drive, which is great. I mean, you need some of that. But what I don't think you quite have at that age, I certainly didn't, was the wisdom, the nuance to see that maybe that passion wasn't the answer to everything. And I would like to see an understanding between those who have got a broader view of things and those that have got the passion, and bringing them both together. Because, again, what you wind up with is older generations tut-tutting at the younger generations. Neither side always uses the strength of the other, and yet working together, it can be absolutely phenomenal. So I would like to hope that we could learn to sort of use the gifts of youth, but also that they would learn to see the wisdom also of those that have lived a little bit longer. And here's the thing. So we see change going on all around us. We see people trying to create change. And, there's no question that this is something that it upsets apple carts. We're so often left in a feeling of helplessness. But if we become proactive and we try to truly understand what's going on, we might get somewhere. And context is the all. We live in a world where everything comes at us in short pulses. News, it's a short pulse. It's a message that comes up on your phone. And everybody gets things in these small bursts. But when we do that, we don't have the wider context. And many people, I think, lose sight of the wider context of history, the patterns of history and the lessons that we can learn from them. And they just see what is immediately in front of them now. And the digital age has certainly brought that to the forefront. And I would encourage anybody to, use the gifts of the digital age. Absolutely. It's incredible how much information can flow, but also try to see the wider continuity of it. Because I think when you do that, you can then use these sort of bits of information you've got as gifts, and you're not then just constantly at the mercy of what the next big sort of dopamine hit's going to be from the next big bit of news or the next opinion you read on Twitter. There's more to it than that. There's a bigger picture, and often it takes a while for the longer game to make itself clear. So I think just a little bit more awareness of that with that drive of youthful passion married together, I think they could be wonderful.
Thank you, Andy, for coming onto the show. If you've enjoyed listening to that, do check out Andy's website, which is truthagenda.org. truthagenda.org, in which you can find his forthcoming talks and, of course, his wonderful book. Thanks for joining Occulture. Hope to see you again, but don't forget, hit the subscribe button. We'll see you soon. All the best.